Behind me is the Out There Bar in 29 Palms, California. Like the sign on the wall says, it's the last cold beer for 100 miles. Now, inside this bar, there's a mural based on a lost 1970s sci-fi film that included Graham Parsons and Michelle Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. And the star of this movie was a young boy who happened to be Brian Jones's son from the Rolling Stones. It's kind of a crazy, unbelievable story, and today we're gonna sit down with Chris Campion. He is a British-born author, journalist, filmmaker, ghostwriter. He's written for the LA Times, for The Guardian, Rolling Stone magazine, and he's doing a deluxe art book based on this lost movie. We're also gonna sit down with Ian Rakow, who is the owner of the Out There Bar, and should be an interesting interview. All right, thanks guys. Chris Campion, Ian Rakow. I'll cut that. Yeah. That'll be the first edit, like 4 seconds in. That's an all new record.
It's an icebreaker.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sitting down with me today.
Sure.
We are in a bar, but it's, we haven't broken out the alcohol yet. There was a guy outside waiting to get in when we were standing in the parking lot. But at any point, if you want to get some whiskey out or something, it might, liven up my interview skills a little bit with you guys.
I don't need to be asked twice.
Yeah. So, we're going to talk about the Saturation 70 project. Tell me a little bit about the Guardian article. That was 2014, correct?
Right.
And was that, how did you originally get onto that story back then?
Actually, there was a story even before that in Mojo magazine.
Okay.
So that was 2013, and I found out about the project just completely by accident. I was interviewing somebody called Stash Klosowski-DeRolla, who's like a legendary rock and roll character. Well, not even rock and roll. He was in the world of. He's the son of a painter called Balthus, and he hung out with the Stones in the '60s. A lot of film people, art people. So I was interviewing him about a completely different subject, and he just kept talking about this film, and he was like, this is the masterpiece that never was. It's just, and like Graham Parsons and Julian Jones, Brian Jones's son. And so my interest was piqued, and I started looking it up, and I couldn't really find any information about it. But Stash did mention the name of the director, Anthony Fouts, so I tracked him down. He was on Facebook, and basically struck up a conversation with him, spoke to him, and he just came out with this incredible story about this movie that he'd made that was sort of lost, basically. They had shot it, then the financing fell through halfway through the production, and it's sort of, everyone moved on, it got forgotten about, and all the footage, no one actually knows where it is at this point.
Had you heard, Ian, about this story, or how did you get involved with this story?
Well, it was many years later. Obviously, this is 2013. We started work on the bar to reopen this bar in 2021, and one of the big projects for the bar was we had this big space that we wanted to do a mural on, and we went through a bunch of different ideas, and eventually, kind of through sort of coincidental suggestions, one from Andy Nathanson, who's in the mural, and one from Adam, who painted the mural, we decided, well, this is what we want to base something on this film. And I did a little bit of research on it. The only thing that was really available was Chris's article from 2013 in Mojo. So I went on eBay, got a copy of the article, and we went from there. And this was before Chris and I knew each other, before I even knew that Chris lived here. It just kind of happened naturally because it just made sense for the bar. It kind of gave some context for the kind of vibe we were trying to portray in the bar, and it just sort of developed.
Yeah, the first time I was at the bar, I was marveling at the mural, not having any idea what it was about, or really understanding any of that connection. So how did you eventually come together with Tony Fouts to decide on potentially doing this book?
I mean, it's been a long time coming. I wrote the story in 2013, and then in 2014, he did a show in London that was, just exhibiting photographs, production stills from the movie that he had, and then some of the footage. There's a very small amount of footage that exists. Yeah. So, and that was a huge success. And then, he found another reel of film, and then we found a whole bunch of photos, and it's pretty improbable that like 50 years later we kept finding things. But now we sort of had enough where there's enough visual imagery to make a really nice book, and but also just tell the entire story, with the cast. Most of the cast and crew, excepting Graham, obviously, are still around.
Yeah.
And all have like very vivid memories of shooting this film, and what it meant for them at the time, and a lot of the people that were involved in it ended up having very stellar careers in Hollywood.
Sure.
The first AD is a man named David McGiffert, who kind of worked on all the Back to the Future movies, worked with Barry Levinson. God, I don't know, the list of people he worked with is endless. He's done films with Robert Redford, like A-list Hollywood movies, massive films. And Saturation 70 was the first film that he ever worked on as an AD or anything related to film.
Wow.
And then there's a lady called Ida Random who was in the movie. She's right behind us. She's wearing a cowgirl suit. And she went on to become a very high-profile production designer in Hollywood, did production design on Rain Man, Kevin Costner movies, was just awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by, I think it's like the Art Directors Association in Hollywood. So these people, this was at the beginning of their careers. They were not really, they established themselves much later, and so this film has a very sort of special place in their hearts, even though no one really knew about it, and no one saw it or anything like that, but it gave them a sort of a break or an introduction into the film industry in some ways.
Yeah.
And there was Trumble too, right?
Right, yeah, and the special effects were going to be done by Douglas Trumbull, who it's really one of the pioneers of special effects in movies. And he passed away last year, but he had just come off 2001 when he started working on Saturation 70. And his next film was Silent Running with Bruce Dern. And really what they were intending to do with Saturation 70 was something that didn't really come to pass until many years later in terms of the kind of special effects that they were going to do, the ones that they were planning. Things that we saw in Star Wars or Blade Runner or anything like that, they were really trying to push the envelope in terms of the kind of imagery.
Tell us a little bit more in detail, kind of what the plot of this film was all about, and just as much information, that you've been able to dig up, which is, I'm sure, pretty difficult. I spent a bunch of time looking stuff up, other stuff on YouTube. There's nothing. And I did find a beer from like a West Coast IPA called Saturation 70.
Yeah, really? Yeah, Tony just, you should get it in the bar. Actually,
there's an English guy who does a YouTube channel, all right, today I'm tasting this beer, and I see it says Saturation 70, and it's got a UFO. And I'm like, okay, that's gotta be some reference.
It is, and actually Tony Fountain sent it to me the other week. He had just found it, so we just I'll have to reach out to them.
Good to know.
Give us as much detail.
I have a little bit of an advantage on everyone else because I've read the script. So there is a script.
Okay, I was wondering if there was a shooting script that you were able to.
Yeah, it's a real. There's an actual fully fledged script. So it's basically, just think the Wizard of Oz, but a sci-fi version of the Wizard of Oz. But it's about a kid who's like a Victorian child who falls through a wormhole, ends up in contemporary Los Angeles at the time, which was like 1969, 1970, and he's separated from his mother, and he's trying to get back to his place and time and find his mother again. And he's sort of assisted by this fairy godmother character who's Ida Random, and then he encounters these aliens who have sort of come down to Earth to try and rid the Earth of like toxins and poisons that are polluting the planet. And it's this sort of very childlike, fable, really. It's sort of, it's quite naive, but also is dealing with issues that have, we're still dealing with today. It was, when Tony wrote the script, he's talking about environmental destruction. He's talking about the problem of, arms and weapons and privacy and all sorts of things that are, 50 years later are still pretty at the forefront of people's concerns, about the world, I guess.
Yeah, it sounds ahead of its time.
I don't know how. I honestly don't know, and I've spoken to Tony a lot, but I don't know how he was coming up with this stuff in 1969. There wasn't an internet. There wasn't, I don't know how he was finding out or sort of coalescing this idea about all of these things. I mean, when I talked to him about the environmental part of the film, he would just sort of say, well, the Whole Earth catalog was around at that time, and there was the start of environmental activism in the 60s, around the the radicalization of radical political groups around the time, whether it was the Panthers, the Weathermen, there was environmental activism that was just starting up, but it was still a very fringe thing to put into a movie.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, Michelle Phillips from Mamas and Papas, was she in the film?
Yeah, she was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just another huge name.
Yeah.
That went on to just do amazing.
Yeah. So Graham Parsons was in the movie. Michelle Phillips. The star of the film was really the young boy.
Yeah.
Who was Brian Jones's son. He was 5 years old at the time. And then the only other person who was really well known at the time was Nudie Cohn, who designed, basically invented the nudie suit. It was named after him. All the country and western suits that Fine Burritos were wearing on the cover of their first album. He had dressed Elvis and Porter Wagoner and everybody in the country music scene. So, but it's the only sci-fi movie that Nudie Cohn ever appeared in.
and Graham was going to be like an alien or something. Not
yeah, so
you wouldn't have known it was him.
That's the funny thing about this is that Graham and Michelle were in it, but they were wearing like hazmats. The aliens they were called the Cosmic Kitties, and they were wearing hazmat suits with gas masks to protect them because they were aliens and they were wanted to be protected from the poison in the environment. Or they'd end up like David Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth and deteriorate pretty rapidly. So you didn't actually see Graham's face in the film, and I guess it speaks to something about Graham Parsons, that he wasn't there wasn't any sort of ego going on there. He was willing to just sort of jump in, and the same with Michelle, and just be in this crazy movie that they had, been sort of. Tony had basically got them to participate in.
In reading your article, I think there was a mention of Tony and Graham, hearing about the UFO convention at Giant Rock and heading out there. Was the film already started, or the idea, or was that kind of the impetus that was like, oh, okay, we're going to do something after this?
Right. So there's a sort of a pre-history to this, which is that Tony Fouts was, prior to Saturation 70, he had written a film for the Rolling Stones, and it was going to be the first. The Stones had tried to make movies at various times. They'd optioned A Clockwork Orange and another book called I can't remember the name of it. No One Left Alive, I think it's called. And they had, the Beatles had made several films. The pop stars were making movies at that time, and this was like 67, 68.
Yeah.
So Tony was working in Italy for a director called Marco Ferreri, who was one of the most, well thought of, Italian movie directors at the time. And he came up with this idea of doing a sci-fi western, and pitched it to Keith Richards, who he met in Italy. He knew Anita Pallenberg, and Anita introduced him to Keith, and then he went off and wrote this movie with Sam Shepard, the playwright, and it was called Maxigasm. And that was a going thing for like 2 years. They had Universal Pictures was going to, had signed on for it. James Coburn was going to star in it. All of the Stones were going to be in it, and it's a really insane film. And he also met Doug Trumbull at that time, who was going to do all the special effects on that movie. It also was set in the desert. It was about desert mercenaries and UFOs and Mayan human ritual sacrifice and all sorts of really crazy stuff that you would never have seen a movie like that at that time in 1968. And so Tony's agent, Michael Griskoff, basically tipped Tony off to this, the Giant Rock Space Convention, and said maybe you should go out there and grab some footage, and you can, basically they were going out there to get footage to test out the special effects for Maxagasm. And so they rented a Winnebago, filled it with people, got a car, got a crew together. That's why, so Graham, Michelle, Julian, everybody that was associated with the film, they all came out to the Giant Rock Space Convention, and they were sort of filming a sort of half documentary, I think, wandering around the space convention. And then when they saw the footage, when they went back to LA, Tony came up with this entirely different idea, and it was all about Julian running around, and the Giant Rock portion of the Saturation 70 was really the end of the movie. Okay. I think that was, so they shot the end of the movie first, and that's how they ended up there. So
yeah, George Van Tassel and the Giant Rock, it's like he's the gift that keeps on giving. Like that guy. His name sort of ends up making its way into all kinds of crazy things. So now, most of the film was lost, or how much?
Yeah, so when I met Tony in 2011, they had like a 5-minute reel, and it was a compilation of scenes that were cut to the Flying Burrito Brothers version of Wild Horses. And there's no Graham Parsons in it, or if there is, he's wearing a mask, so I don't know. But it's this, it's a great little trailer. It looks like a promo video from like a contemporary music video. But people weren't making music videos like that at that time. So that was, that's all that exists of the actual film. And then a few years ago, Tony found another reel, which was a promo reel that they had shot to show potential backers the special effects and the people that were involved in the film. And so that had a tour of Douglas Trumbull's Studio City workshop, where he was, where he was basically coming up with these advanced computer effects at the time. And then it also had footage of Roger McGuinn from the Byrds, who was going to do the soundtrack on his Moog synthesizer, which I think is I don't think anyone's seen Roger McGuinn with a Moog synthesizer. They're used to him playing like a guitar. A die-hard folky, but he was a big tech head.
That was so cutting edge at that time.
Yeah, Tony, when I talked to Tony, and he knew Roger pretty well at that time, he said Roger was the first person he knew who had a telephone in his car. And in 1969.
Yeah, baller.
So there's footage of Roger in the studio, and then there's this absolutely priceless footage of Graham sitting in the Chateau Marmont playing the piano that no one has ever seen. And there's really not that much footage of Graham Parsons. There's there's one TV appearance where they're playing Flying Burrito songs. There's a promo video for the second album, and then there's like a live video from like 73, I think, maybe 72, 73, and that's it. So there's not that much of this footage, but it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
It's it's quite candid, so you see Graham in a way that no one's really ever seen.
To backtrack just a little bit, when you were talking earlier just about the whole film and whatnot, was it just a financing issue that fell apart that caused this whole project to basically get shelved?
The producer was a pretty big Hollywood agent. He's called Perry Leff, and he left CMA, which I think he was one of the founding agents, and then started running A&M Films, and then left that and started his own thing, which was called Dimension 5, and that's what, he came on board to do Saturation 70, but the production company was being funded by like mutual funds, by securities basically on the stock market, and there was a crash in the price of gold at that time, like 1970, I think. The price of gold dropped below the gold standard, so mutual funds and securities were in the toilet, and I guess that's what that's what I've been able to gather, about why the funding fell apart. And then, Tony just basically went off and started another project pretty much straight away. He had all these things that were sort of bubbling along, so it just didn't happen, and everyone went off and did other things, and it just sort of forgot about it.
Yeah. You mentioned that you do have a shooting script. Right. I was curious, what other materials and things have you been able to put together that you're able to include in the book?
There's a lot of, there were production stills that were shot. So some of the scenes that there's not footage for, there's like imagery that we have. So we have Polaroids that were shot on set, that really just for the cinematographer, Bruce Logan, so he could look at the setups. There was an on-set photographer. We've got these really great photos from the Giant Rock Space Convention, that are more, just documentary style photos of the Space Convention, and Graham and Michelle and everybody running around in there. There's a script, there's various other bits and pieces of sort of ephemera that's in Tony's archive that we're just going to pull it all together and, have myself and Tony and the cast and crew basically telling anecdotes from the shooting.
It sounds amazing. It was just only maybe a week or so ago, and I think I saw here just one of the little flyers about the project, and I was like, this sounds amazing. When did you meet Chris and get involved in this thing?
We met probably 2 or 3 months after we opened, right? And Chris came in with a mutual friend, and we didn't know each other before this, and I said hi to the friend, the mutual friend of ours, and then Chris, I just saw him turn over his shoulder, and his jaw dropped. Like literally, it's the first time I've ever seen that happen. And he looked over his shoulder, his jaw dropped, and then he looked back at me, and he looked at me like completely stunned. He said, "How did this happen?" And I thought I was in trouble. I thought like he was mad, but it was actually the opposite. You were surprised, pleasantly surprised, I think.
Right.
But I think it was just so unexpected that because you didn't have any idea when you came in that this was here.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
So that's how we met.
Okay, so I'm going to back up a second. So when you had Adam come in to do this mural, you knew a little bit about the story.
Yeah.
Had not made any of these other connections. Yeah. So this was like a meeting, just like one of those chance encounters.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
is crazy.
Yeah.
Something so, obscure that very few people had heard about must have been,
Well, the other part of it was that, this is a story that I wrote 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And, they had to track down a copy of the magazine. It wasn't even online. The Guardian article was online. But the original, all of this imagery comes from the original story that I wrote for Mojo. Yeah. And that, they had to buy a copy.
Tell us about the Kickstarter project to get the book going. When can we possibly expect a release date? Those kind of things.
Yeah. So we basically put up a Kickstarter last month. It's running till November 10th. Really just to build awareness and like pre-order the book. And do some, sort of advanced press, and then we're going to put the book out in April next year. Okay. And it's pretty much all ready to go. Mm-hmm. It was just like, okay, we'll do this and start building a buzz about it.
Yeah.
So it'll come out April next year, and I'll do, I'd like to do some like pop-up events and screen some of the footage.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Yeah, I will make sure to put in the show notes on the podcast and links in the video here for the Kickstarter. project and everything. I already donated and am back in the project, so
Thank you.
can't wait to
Really appreciate it.
get those things. So I really appreciate you taking your time and sitting down with us today. It's
Yeah, thank
really
you for
awesome.
asking.
Great,
Yeah.
amazing story.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.